Alright, so this is Chapter 1, The Language of Origin. The English language contains a multitude of synonyms. This is thanks to the historical evolution of the English language. There are three historical layers of language. Being aware of these layers can help one to analyze a passage and pick out the dominant layer. This can be done by either analyzing the whole passage or picking out key words and analyzing them. 1. Old English. This layer is most often used for clarity and sincerity. Old English has streaks of German influence, Latin and Greek influence, and Scandinavian Viking influences. Many core words of the English language, or the simplest and most frequently used words, come from Old English. For example, they, dirt, hit, flat, and egg. That's page 24. Another part of this layer is Germanic, like the English seen in Beowulf. Friend, in, and sleep, life, death. Page 25 of the text. Additionally, many words associated with Christianity come from this layer, such as priest, altar, relic, shrine, disciple, hymn, and that's from page 25 of the text. Second layer is Norman French. This layer is most often used for elevation and panache. When the Normans invaded England, French-speaking people were appointed to govern the English, so many words of Norman French origin were introduced into the English language. Words relating to the court and legal system come from that layer as well. Felony, attorney, jury, sue, verdict, crime. They were engaged with military rule over the English, so many military terms come from here. Soldier, lieutenant, army, enemy, guard, retreat, and battle. Many fancy words come from the French layer, especially those that make a common noun more elegant. Example, house to mansion, wish to desire, strength to vigor. Today, we still look to the French for the finer things. The third layer is Latin and Greek. This layer is most often used for formality and erudition. During the rule of the Normans in England, clergy, scholars, and other officials learned and wrote in Latin while the common people were speaking English and French. In the 15th to 17th centuries, more and more words were being borrowed from Latin and Greek. Many daily words come from these borrowings from Latin and Greek. Fact, explain, contradict, appropriate, system. Many words also came from contact with world influences. Yacht, cruise, tea for Dutch, coffee for Turkish and Arabic, zero for Italian and Arabic. And from words taken from Native Americans after America was settled. Raccoon, hickory, pecan, and moose. And also from Spanish speakers settled in the U.S. Plaza, tornado, ranch, barbecue. Homonyms and synonyms. One way that our layers shine is through synonyms. This happens with many words. A set like scare, frighten, terrify, or thin, gaunt, emaciated. Old English to French to Latin. Fahnestock Rhetorical Style, WR311 Spring 2017, Chapter 2, New Words and Changing Uses. Also known as the chapter that Carl accidentally didn't do the first time that we compiled the study guide. We hear the lovely phone from the writing center in the background because someone at the desk isn't picking it up, which means that someone at the desk is just, enjoying the end of the semester instead of actually picking up these wonderful appointments. Anyway, Chapter 2, New Words and Changing Uses. An invented word is a neologism. Clipping is the process of taking parts of two words and fusing them together, such as slamgrass from slam dancing and bluegrass. So that's clipping. Languages grow by taking in words from other languages, kind of like, cells attaching to other organisms and just absorbing them. Words enter a language when the things they denote enter people's lives. So when a new object enters someone's life, it needs a word. Languages also grow when existing words are merged together. Nouns can join with nouns, adjectives with nouns, and verbs with nouns. Derivational families are words derived from other words, families of related terms. For example, the lover loves the loved one lovingly, all derived from love. Clipping, that's taking parts of existing words off of existing words and creating shorter coinages. App from application, hyper from hyperactive, detox from detoxification. Blends. Brad Pitt and Angelina blend to create Brangelina. They're divorced now. Two parts from existing words blend together to form a new word. Also known as portmanteau words. Conversions. Pressing a term from one part of speech into service in another, using the verb slather as a noun, a full slather. Most commonly occurs when nouns become verbs. So when a noun becomes a verb. Catatrasis is a trope. Catatrasis, right. Borrowing of an available word to designate something that lacks a label. So catatrasis is borrowing an available word to designate something that lacks a label, i.e. calling a warrior a lion. Example is spam, originally to mean canned lunch meat, was adopted or stolen to mean unsolicited email. So it started off as something and then was designated something else without a label, such as spam to unread email. Spam now does mean unwanted junk mail instead of the traditionally canned ham. Acronyms are formed from the first letters of strings of words, FBI from Federal Bureau of Investigations. Proper names to common nouns. Xerox from the name of the company to photocopy. The proper names of people and products can shift into the language as common nouns. Proper names can be turned into adjectives for nonce usage. That's invented words for a particular occasion. Analogy. That's forming a word according to the model of another word that is close in meaning, such as prequel from sequel. Also, masculism from feminism. I didn't even realize masculism was a thing. Fabrication. That's creating a product name from existing words with persuasive connotations, i.e. Mr. Clean. And there are two different ways. You can either create a product name from existing words or fabricate an entirely new word as a name. Example, Pantene. Onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is not a trope, but an activity by which the most fitting terms are formed by having been fashioned after the sounds themselves. Boom, bang, squeak, squish. Sound words name the sound as nouns. So the sound words name the sound as nouns. Taboo, deformation. That deforms or creates a sound, a like word, as a polite replacement for a word which might be offensive, i.e. darn it instead of damn it. Pretty sure a lot of euphemisms fall into this category. Doubling or reduplication. Goody-goody is more than just good. Repetition means intensification, i.e. riff-raff. Loss and migration. The language changes as words disappear, lose meanings, or acquire new ones. Meanings get shed and acquire new ones over time, such as junk no longer meaning old rope. New words flood into the language, and old words trickle out. Alright, so this is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style, Chapter 3, WR311 Spring 2017 for Dr. Camper's class. Chapter 3, Categories of Word Choice. Coinages mean lost or changing meanings. A logologist is a student of words. The mental lexicon is the vocabulary in the heads of most people using the same language. Lexical means a conceptual field, so a group of words in fuzzy sets of meanings related in predictable ways. So essentially it's a group of words that have a connection, such as scientific terms, or the mental lexicon here, rather the lexical conceptual field here would be rhetorical terms. Content analysis. That's where the text is dissolved into clustered lists of words with related meanings. The level of generality. That relates a term as though they were organized into a Linnean system of classification. Is that Linnean or Linnaean? Looks too much like Father Linnaean for me. Hypernyms. That's terms higher in the hierarchy as furniture is to chair. So this is the hierarchy that we're talking about. So terms higher in the hierarchy are hypernyms as furniture is to chair. Hyponyms, lower from the E to the O. Terms are lower in the hierarchy when they are hyponyms, as is chair to recliner. So hypernyms are furniture to chair, showing how furniture is higher than chair. And the hyponym is the chair to recliner, showing the chair is lower on this ladder than the recliner. Prototype. The member of a group most likely to occur to an audience as a representative of that group. So prototypical in this sense. Concrete words can be used to refer to physical objects and actions or to immediate sense impressions, loud, velvety. Abstract words, higher in the lexical hierarchy that refer to general qualities, broad categories, or relationships. The following list of words goes from more concrete to abstract. Marco, name given to a specific dog. Golden Retriever, the breed of the dog. Dog, general term. Pet, category. Animal, larger category. Organism includes all living things. The locus is the line of argument concerning genus. A thesis is an indefinite claim. A hypothesis is an underthesis or a definite claim. Indefinite questions are those which may be maintained or impugned without reference to persons, time, or place, and the like. Definite questions involve facts, persons, time, and the like. So the difference between a definite question and an indefinite question is that the definite question involves something concrete, like facts, persons, time, and everything like that, whereas indefinite questions can be maintained without reference to specific persons, time, or place. Terministic screens. Patterns of word choice distinctive of an author or ideology that have significant consequences for their uses. So this is distinctive of a single author or an ideology. That's a terministic screen. A positive term is most unambiguously itself when it names a visible and tangible thing which can be located in time or place. It's a concrete term. So it names a visible and tangible thing. Dialectical terms. Fictitious entries, quote unquote, words for ideas, not things, for principles and doctrines, refer to notions that are often in contention. So these are words dialectical for ideas, not things, not tangible things. Ultimate terms, using a guiding idea or a unitary principle behind the diversity of voices. So this is a unifying term. There are degrees of positive and negative connotations in these ultimate terms. For example, God words are positive. So these are like the ultimate terms you could possibly use in America, the idea of patriotism, God, and other specific things that have an ultimate positive connotation. Devil words, negative, like we talked about in class, such as communism, such as, I don't know, North Korea or something like that, something with an ultimate negative term. North Korea probably isn't the best example, but Satan for sure. Communism was up there for a while. Radical Islam is another. And then charismatic words are charming. So these ultimate words, God words are positive, devil words are negative. No matter who you're saying to, these connotations will shine through. No matter who you're saying them to, I should say. And then charismatic words are charming. All right, this is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style Study Guide, Chapter 4, WR311, Dr. Camper's class. And this is Chapter 4, Language Varieties, aka Key Terms. Part 1, Levels of Style. Measure for determining the appropriateness of a text for a certain audience, subject, situation, and rhetor. 1 is simple/low, which is conversational and colloquial language suitable for friendly exchanges and comic accounts, simple or low. Medium, that's unmarked, neutral language, appropriate for straight narration and exposition, kind of like this. And then grand and high is highly formal and ornate language, appropriate for the highest, most serious, and intense topics, also known as academia sometimes. Part 2, colloquial language. Language that is characteristic of or appropriate to ordinary or familiar conversation rather than formal speech or writing. A graphilect is a standardized written language. A dialect is a regional variety of language distinguished by features of vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation from other regional varieties and constituting together with them a single language. So the graphilect is the standardized language. The dialect is regional variance. The regiolect is a dialect spoken in a particular geographical region. So I suppose there is like a northeastern United States regiolect where someone who is in the regiolect of the southern United States may have absolutely no idea what a vineyard vines is. A sociolect is the dialect of a particular social class. So you look at the aristocracy, they have a sociolect, which is not colloquial language. A phonetic represents the sounds and other phenomena of speech. An alteration of ordinary spelling that better represents the spoken language uses characters of the regular alphabet and uses conventional spelling. Also can mean representing speech sounds by means of symbols. An ethnolect is a variety of language associated with a certain ethnic or cultural subgroup. An idiolect is the speech habits peculiar to a particular person. So we're on different levels of classification here, going from the regiolect, which is the dialect spoken in a particular geographical region, versus the sociolect is the dialect of a particular social class, and then the idiolect is the speech habits peculiar to a particular person. The register is a subset of language tied to a particular activity or situation. Subject labels are labels used in dictionaries to show that a word is part of a language of a particular subject and establish appropriate disciplinary concepts. A genre is a category of artistic, musical, or literary composition characterized by a particular style, form, or content. Usually contains consistent language features or registers. A register shift is the insertion of a word or phrase that comes from another discourse niche to make a shift in the register. So literally, it's when you insert something that's not from the same register to make the register something different, or to shift the register in a different direction. Register mixing is writing part of a text in one language variety and another part in a different language variety, and this indicates attempts to reach multiple audiences. For example, in some of the non-expert audience research papers that we did, there was a way to use colloquial language to engage with a wider audience to then move someone in the direction of paying attention to a scientific fact. So that'd be a register mix. Facilitas is the ability to speak readily and appropriately, and appositely rather, on any occasion. A cliché is a trite or stereotyped expression or phrase that has lost its originality due to overuse. Idioms are an expression in the usage of a language that is peculiar to itself, either grammatically or in having a meaning that cannot be derived from the conjoined meaning of its elements. In basic English, this is the expression or the usage of a language that is peculiar to itself, either grammatically, right, or having a meaning that cannot be derived from the conjoined meanings of these elements. So it's unique in that. When you hear an idiomatic expression, that's something that's specific, something that's you're probably not going to find anywhere else. It's particular to itself. Maxims are short, pithy statements expressing a general truth or rule of conduct. For example, the bigger the better and opposites attract. Proverbs are another short, pithy saying in general use, stating a general truth or piece of advice. Example, a friend in need is a friend indeed. An allusion is an expression designed to call something to mind without mentioning it explicitly. This is an indirect or passing reference. This is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style, Chapter 5 for Dr. Camper's WR311 course in spring of 2017. We've gotten to tropes. So a trope, defined by Henry Peacham, is an artificial alteration of a word or sentence from the proper and natural signification to another which is not proper. Quintilian defines a trope as a change with strength of a word or phrase from its proper signification to another. César de Marsay describes tropes as a word taken in a signification which is not precisely its proper signification. So this is a literal versus an atypical or figural use of a word. Here are 4 devices classified as tropes. Synecdoche is naming a part to stand for the whole. It makes the audience realize, quote, many things from one, whole from a part, the genus from the species, end quote. Example is all hands on deck. It's naming a part of something to stand for the whole. So the way to identify a synecdoche is to look at the sentence, think about what is being used in the trope, and then think of whether or not that signifies something larger. As if the genus can signify the species, the hands refer to the men in this case, when they're the men or women who are being called to the deck. So when they say all hands on deck, that's the synecdoche. In social science writing, children of divorced parents are referred to as the child of divorce. In medicine, persons with AIDS are collectively referred to as AIDS patients, or as AIDS patient. Metonymy. Substitutions with terms chosen according to some recoverable specific principle of association. Examples. Inventor for the things he invented. Macintosh jacket, named after the inventor Charles Macintosh. So the substitution being used is the word Macintosh jacket instead of the things that he invented. Author for the work. She plays Mozart very well. Container for the contained. Have another glass instead of saying have another drink. That's metonymy. So these 2 words that are being used in the metonymy here are explicitly related. Mozart is related to the composer. The Macintosh jacket is related to Macintosh. The glass is explicitly related to whatever is in the glass that's being substituted. This is a cause for effect and effect for a cause. Warm wine because wine brings a warmth. Location for the thing. There was bad news on Wall Street today. Metaphor. Now this is the difference between a metaphor and metonymy. The metonymy has these recoverable specific principles of association, whereas the metaphor exhibits terms inserted into an unexpected context. This brings over a term from an alien field to create a novel pairing that expresses a point. So these are two different things being brought together. For example, the Iron Curtain. The distinction between metaphor and other tropes, including synecdoche and metonymy, which have logical associations with the terms they replace, is that metaphors do not have to have a direct connotation to the word it replaces or joins. So that's the biggest part. Synecdoche is explicitly the part for the whole, whereas metonymy is substitutions according to some specific principle of association. Now, theoretically, these can be crossed somewhat, but the most explicit definition and the most explicit difference between the synecdoche and the metonymy is that the synecdoche has to have that incline there. The part has to stand for the whole in synecdoche. Whereas in metonymy, the terms that are chosen that replace each other just have to have an association, not necessarily the incline. And then the metaphor is different unexpected contexts. Irony makes a claim by saying the opposite, with the further stipulation that the speaker uses this mode intentionally and expects the hearer to recognize it, so it's intentional. Sources of detection. From the manner of delivery, from the appearance or known character of the speaker, from the objects of agreement, from the immediate context, from the manner of presentation, from the character of the author or source, from the objects of agreement, or from the context itself. So there must always be at least two parties in irony, the one using the device and the one understanding the device being used. So they make a claim by saying the opposite, with the further stipulation that the speaker uses this mode intentionally and expects the hearer to recognize it. That's intentional irony. Intolerable irony is that irony cannot be used in straight news reporting or instruction manuals. So the place where you're not going to find irony is the place where the audience can't get confused or cannot be trusted to identify a device like that, because if you had an ironic instruction manual, that would end really badly. Hyperbole is an exaggeration. I've told him 1,000 times, meaning a few times. Litotes is an understatement, the opposite of hyperbole. An orated war hero says, I have a few medals. A decorated war hero would say that. An amphibole is a phrase that can genuinely have two meanings, intentional ambiguity. An amphibole is different from a paradox because the paradox is deliberately self-contradicting. We need to increase troop levels to decrease them, or you need to die in order to learn how to live. So the amphibole can genuinely have two meanings, intentional ambiguity, which I think from this means that they actually both have to make sense and both kind of have to be true and workable, whereas the paradox is self-contradicting. Paralysis is to mention without mentioning. I am not going to mention X, which means you immediately did mention X. This is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style study guide for Dr. Martin Camper's WR311 class, Spring 2017, Chapter 6, Figures of Word Choice. Agnominatio is when a rhetor alters a word by adding, deleting, transposing, or replacing letters to create a pair of similar words to express dissimilar things. Thus, these two words must appear next to one another. So this is when the rhetor alters the word by adding, deleting, transposing, or replacing letters to create a pair of words that express dissimilar things. And then the two words must appear next to one another. A metaplasm is altering a single word for rhetorical effect similar to agnominatio, but only includes one word. Polyptoton is modifying the spelling or inflection of a word to slightly change the meaning. So, for example, changing dream to dreamer. Ploki epitomizes an argument by using the same form of the word appearing again and again in the argument. So this is epitomizing an argument by using the same form of a single word that appears repeatedly throughout the argument. Antenna-classis repeats the orthographic or phonological word, but in different functional categories or with different or even contrary meanings. Basically, these are puns. So, antenna-classis repeats the orthographic or phonological word, but in different functional categories. So different categories, same word, with different or even contrary meanings. So that makes it a pun. Isocolon produces phrases with an equal number of syllables. The easiest way to identify an isocolon is to count the syllables in both phrases. A homeopoptaton ends successive phrases with a word having the same case endings. Homeotelauton ends successive phrases with like sounds or rhyming endings. So the homeopoptaton ends successive phrases with a word having the same case endings. So that's case endings. And then the homeotelauton ends successive phrases with like-sounding or rhyming endings. So it's the same case ending versus rhyming or like-sounding endings. Assonance is a repetition of vowel sounds. Consonance is a repetition of consonant sounds. And synonyms are words that have roughly the same denotation while differing in connotation or suitability in certain purposes or contexts. So again, a synonym, roughly the same denotation, so pretty much the same meaning, in different connotations or suitability in certain purposes or contexts. So the best way to identify a synonym, as was mentioned previously in the way in which you can draw synonyms from 3 different layers of English, is to then take a look at where the word is being used and in what context, and then which one of those would be most appropriate for the context it's being used in. A euphemism substitutes a polite or mild expression instead of a crude, offensive, or obscene term. So it's similar to a synonym in that sense, but it's not the same because it's specifically replacing a vulgar expression with a polite or mild expression. A correctio is when a writer retracts what has been said already and replaces it with what seems more suitable. However, the original mistake is usually deliberate. So this is when someone makes a deliberate mistake, usually, quote-unquote mistake, and then specifically makes that mistake in order to correct it later. That's the correctio. A dubitatio is when a speaker asks which of 2 or more words he would be better off using. So the speaker is specifically querying whether or not the audience would agree with 1 or 2 different words. Emphasis or significatio is the use of leading words that suggest more than is actually stated. We would call this innuendo. So to go back through that real quick, the main differences here are between I'm never going to get this right. Homeopoptaton is the ending of successive phrases with a word having the same case endings, and homeotelauton ends successive phrases with like-sounding or rhyming endings. So the difference between those 2 very similarly sounding terms is that the one of them is the one that has the same case endings, and then the homeotelauton is the successive phrases with like-sounding or rhyming endings, not the same case endings. Assonance refers to repetition of vowel sounds, whereas consonance refers to the repetition of consonant sounds. And then the difference between a synonym and a euphemism is that the euphemism specifically needs to have the predisposition of substituting a crude, offensive, or obscene term with a polite or mild expression, whereas synonyms can have roughly the same denotation while differing in connotation or suitability in certain purposes or contexts. This is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style for Dr. Camper's WR311 writing class, spring semester 2017, Chapter 8, Sentence Construction, Modification. So a clause is a minimum unit featuring a subject and a verb. A clause is a subject and a verb. So it's something, it's a subject, and it's doing something, which is the verb. An independent clause is a simple sentence with a simple predication. 2 or more independent clauses creates a compound sentence. Keyword is compound. And in order to have a compound, you have to have 2 or more things. A dependent clause can be added to an independent clause to build up complex sentences. And there are 3 types of dependent clauses: adverbs, adjectives, and nouns. Types of dependent clauses. An adverb clause allows rhetors to create a predication complete with subject and verb, tied with subordinating conjunction, usually attached before or after an independent clause. Subordinating conjunctions specify semantic relation of the subordinate clause to the main clause. Resulting clauses function as adverbial modifiers. These include because, since, although, unless, while, when, until, after, whereas, if as, just as, to name some. So the subordinating conjunctions specifically conjoin two clauses. Because, since, although, unless. They can't function on their own. They need to conjoin and specify the semantic relation of the subordinate clause to the main clause. The types of adverb clauses. Result expresses the projected result of an action of the main clause. For example, nuclear weapons are so destructive and ballistic missiles are so swift that any substantially increased possibility of their use or any sudden change in their deployment may well be regarded as a definite threat to peace. So the result expresses the projected result of the action of the main clause. The purpose adverb clause functions as a premise. For example, our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. So the purpose adverb clause here is so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction. Provisio specifies circumstances for the argument in the main clause. So it's expressing the circumstances provided, essentially. It's providing those from the provisio, the specific circumstances for each argument in the main clause. For example, it is our hope to convince the Soviet Union that she, too, should let each nation choose its own future, so long as that choice does not interfere with the choice of others. So it's the specific circumstance for the argument of the main clause. Conditional clauses are common and usually begin with if. And there are two important uses in arguments: to either stipulate circumstances, express dependencies, convey demands with consequences, and also expresses a fortiori argument, which argues for the likelihood of one claim based on another claim that is either more or less likely. To go through that again. Two important uses in arguments here: to stipulate circumstances, if something is this way, then; to express dependencies, and to convey demands with consequences. If this happens, then this will happen. And also expresses a fortiori argument, which argues for the likelihood of one claim based on another claim that is either more or less likely. A comparative clause allows rhetors to introduce standards of reference into an argument. It can also deliver arguments from analogy in a simple sentence. For example, from a Richard Nixon speech, "There is no more justification for wasting money on unnecessary military hardware than there is for wasting it on unwarranted social programs." So this is an argument from analogy, and these two clauses are being compared. So these are referential to each other. These are the standards of reference into this argument. So the two things being referred here in the analogy, the first one is this wasting money on unnecessary military hardware, and the second one is on the unwarranted social programs. Those are being compared thanks to the clause. An adjective clause is also a relative clause, is used to modify a noun or any construction functioning as a noun. And this usually opens with a relative pronoun, which refers to the noun modified, like who, whose, whom, that, and which. And it usually appears immediately after the term it modifies, and it usually interrupts an independent clause with qualifying information. So you can have a sentence that's going on independently, minding its own business, and then the adjective clause modifies the noun or any construction functioning as a noun inside said independent clause. And it can interrupt that independent clause with information relative to the noun in the original clause. This is why both Dr. Camper and the Honorable Professor McIntyre from the Communications Department both had to spend a bit of their course time talking about clauses in grammar, which depending on whichever one of them you ask, should have been something we were equipped with well before WR311. That digression is the subject of another podcast. Types of adjective clauses. A restrictive adjective clause provides necessary clarification, and it's left unpunctuated. A non-restrictive adjective clause contains details treated as peripheral, set off in commas from the rest of the sentence. So the restrictive provides necessary clarification. It's something that's vital to be clarified, whereas the non-restrictive can contain details treated as peripheral, and it's set off in commas to separate it, where it'd be like Carl Damelt, comma, a junior, comma, from the rest of the sentence. Complement clause modifies a noun or some adjectives, opens with a that functioning as a conjunction. So the idea that I have $1 billion is fantastic. So this clause that opens with that is complementing the original clause. So that functions as the conjunction in that sentence, and then it modifies the noun or some adjectives. The idea that I have $1 billion is fantastic because it's complementing something. It's nice. A noun clause is a complete predication clause inserted where a single noun or a noun phrase could appear. So it's a complete predication or clause inserted where a single noun or noun phrase could appear. For example, I do not believe that Soviet Russia desires war. Phrases built on verbs. Participles are formed in English either by adding ing to a verb or by adding ed, aka the present participle, or by using the appropriate form of an irregular verb, aka the past participle. Therefore, participle phrases are created by adding modifiers or objects, or more, to a participle. They can function as adjectives, and they usually occur next to the noun they modify. So, throwing the dog a bone, considering him a success, given another chance. So these modifiers are added, and then they can function as adjectives. And they usually occur next to the noun that they modify. So throwing the dog a bone, considering him a success, given another chance. Infinitives always contain to followed by the plain form of a verb. So the plain form of a verb is just the verb. So for example, to sing, to impress, to sit down. They come in perfect, to have one, progressive, to be sailing, passive, to be improved, and they can be modified with adverbs, to sing sweetly, to sing in the shower, to sing in the middle of class. They can take an object or complement, to sing a song, to be sending him a letter, to have labeled the fruit organic. So, infinitive phrases are very versatile, and they fill any sentence role, subject, predicate, complement, etc. They are often a part of the main verb phrase in a sentence rather than the verb modifier, and they pack action into the sentence. To send a letter requires a stamp. Our goal is to win the race. Phrases built on nouns. Nouns can be modified by phrases built on a second noun with a clear relationship to the first. An appositive is built on a noun renaming the noun it modifies, and this allows readers to clarify a noun by inserting another noun, a noun plus modifiers, immediately after it. For example, Botswana, the original noun, a landlocked African nation. So the appositive renames the noun it modifies, and it allows readers to clarify a noun by inserting another noun or a noun plus modifiers immediately after it. So the original noun here we have is Botswana, and we are then redefining Botswana as a landlocked African nation. Absolute construction. Built on a noun related to the noun it modifies as part of a feature. The driver, his hair invisible under his cap. So this is built on a noun related to the noun it modifies as part of a particular feature of the noun. So the feature being added to the driver here is that his hair is invisible under his cap. A resumptive modifier is built by repeating the noun it modifies. Example, the letter from the president, a letter without precedent. So this is resumptive because it repeats the noun that it modifies. So the first noun example here we have is the letter, and then the letter from the president gets repeated as a letter without precedent. I also like the fact that this person, whoever did this, put in president and then precedent because the word sounds similar. A summative modifier is built on a noun summarizing or generalizing a preceding clause or phrase. For example, the committee voted 10-1, a departure from its usual practice. So this is built on a noun summarizing or generalizing a preceding clause or phrase. Single word modifiers. A single word adjective can modify any noun in a sentence. It can come immediately before the noun they modify, and it names the essential properties or qualities of the nouns they modify, and this includes comparative or superlative degrees. Comparative, obviously making a comparison. Superlative saying this is the best thing or this is the worst thing, because superlative usually means some kind of extreme. Thank you, Spanish class. Single word adverbs. They can modify any verb, adjective, or other adverb, and also come immediately before the noun they modify. They provide critical information about an action and also includes the comparative and superlative degrees. So the single word adjectives modify any noun in a sentence, and the single word adverbs modify any verb, adjective, or other adverb, specifically the difference. Modifying structures available in English, clauses, phrases, single words, can build up sentences in two ways. They can be multilapidated, I think that's actually a spelling mistake. Right, starting over. Modifying structures available in English, clauses, phrases, single words, can build up sentences in two ways. They can be multiplied 2 or 3 or occasionally more, and also can be embedded so that one refers to the other. So these are how sentences go from being very, very basic, where you have a subject and a verb, to where you can get multiple modifying structures building up and actually referring to each other in a single sentence. This is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style for Dr. Camper's WR311 Style course in Spring 2017. This is Chapter 9, Sentence Architecture. Emphasis and presence are 20th century terms for classical rhetoric's insistence on amplification. The resources for emphasis in spoken language are dramatic. So to emphasize something in spoken language, these resources are dramatic. Many have to do with gestures of the face and body accompanying speech, the significant hand movement, the direction of gaze, the lowering of eyebrows. Prosody. Every group of words spoken aloud will have a certain prosody, a sound contour, or a certain music of utterance. Pitch. Speakers naturally vary the pitch of the sounds they produce, making some higher or lower. Intensity. They also vary the intensity, making some louder or softer. Duration. They also change the duration, prolonging some sounds and hurrying over others. Intonation. They can also vary intonation, for example, putting glides or slides into vowels and pronouncing them in ways they are not normally uttered. Pause. They can pause before a significant point. Vary the length of the pause to suggest nuances of reluctance, doubt, anger, embarrassment, etc. Capitalization also indicates the spoken differences of increased intensity and duration. Emphasis by position. When speakers come to the end of a segment or sentence, they usually drop their voices and linger slightly on the final word, following it up with a pause. Linguists refer to this as the nucleus, or accented syllable on the final tone unit. Clauses or phrases also receive different attention that put emphasis on certain clauses over the other. For example, though some are leaving in July, I am staying through the summer. The emphasis is on the word July, ending the subordinate clause. Emphasis by sentence role. subject, verb, object receive more emphasis than secondary sentence elements, which are the words, phrases, and clauses that perform adverbial and adjectival functions. So the subject, the verb, and the object get more emphasis because they are the primary sentence elements. And then the secondary sentence elements, the ones that modify the subject, verb, and object, are the words, phrases, and clauses that perform the modifying actions of the adverbial and adjectival functions. Emphasis from inversion. Typical English sentences follow the standard subject, verb, object. Rhetorical style manuals note any small switching of two elements under the label of anastrophe. Hyperbaton is a larger reordering of constituents. Hyperbaton is a larger reordering of constituents. The night was clear and starry. Clear and starry was the night. Placement of modifiers, branching left, right, and the middle. When the modifiers placed in the sentence appear in three different ways, each one of those different ways can do something different for the modification of the sentence. They can appear before, in the middle, or after the main predication of a sentence. Branch to the left. A sentence that opens with the modifying structures and so postpones its subject. In this distance, above the noise of the crowd, I thought I could hear the sound of guns. So this sentence is left branched because in this distance, above the noise of the crowd, comes before, to the left of, I thought I could hear the sound of guns. Branching to the right is a sentence that is complete grammatically but continues with modifying clauses or phrases. There were hundreds of small groups. That's originally the end of that first grammatical sentence, but now is going to be continued with modifying clauses. There were hundreds of small groups, each concentrated around someone who was lecturing the others, using the familiar, heavy public gestures of the Chinese. In the middle, a sentence that inserts material between the subject and the verb. Even the small children stared intently is just the original sentence, with the subject being even the small children, the verb being stared intently, but the middle branch makes it sound like this. Even the small children, brought there with the rest of the family, stared intently. Periodic sentences and loose sentences. Periodic sentence is the position of greatest emphasis on a sentence is the end. And, second, that the main grammatical elements of a clause receive relatively more emphasis than subordinate elements. So again, the periodic sentence, the position of greatest emphasis in this sentence is the end, and the main grammatical elements, the subject, the verb, the object, the complement, receive relatively more emphasis than subordinate elements. It completes itself grammatically and/or delivers its meaning, often dramatically, at the end. Loose sentences. When a sentence completes itself grammatically and then trails off in accumulated detail, neither arousing nor satisfying a compelling need for a concluding point, and is labeled as such. Such loose sentences branch to the right with phrases and dependent clauses. So this is where a sentence can complete itself grammatically and then just go off in accumulated detail, going and going and going and going, and it doesn't arouse or satisfy a compelling need for a concluding point because the completion that was being sought for grammatically was already done at the beginning. And the composition of sentences, you need clearness and precision, unity, strength, and harmony. And then let's see. Right. So this is Chapter 9, Class Notes. There's a continuation of the study guide notes on this chapter. So the clauses, subject and predicate. Independent clause is when a compound sentence has two independent clauses joined by conjunctions or commas or colons. So the compound sentences have two independent clauses joined by conjunctions or commas or colons. The dependent clause here is the adjective, relative, the noun, the adverb, which is subordinate, and then complex sentences have one independent and one dependent clause. Adverbs are a word or phrase that modifies or qualifies an adjective, verb, or other adverb or a word group, expressing a relation of place, time, circumstance, manner, cause, and degree. Adjective-relative clause, the clause is modifying the noun. The woman who is wearing green is my mother. The wearing green modifies the woman. This is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style for Dr. Camper's Style WR311 class in spring of 2017. And this is Chapter 12 on Prosody and Punctuation. Prosody means the aspects of oral presentation and communication, such as changes in volume or pitch, or the length of a pause or phrase that are difficult to accurately convey using text alone. Usually, this falls into the delivery canon of rhetoric. This can be conveyed using various textual emphases, but nobody takes that seriously. Paralinguistic features. Behaviors such as gestures and facial expressions that convey meaning beyond the use of spoken or written language. Obviously, spoken written language is something which inherently does not contain paralinguistic features because gestures and facial expressions are not generally available when solely using auditory delivery or written delivery. Scriptio continua. This was the first form of writing used as a memory aid to ancient orators. It looked something like this, and there's about 50 consonants and some vowels splattered onto the page. You get the point. They invented punctuation shortly afterwards because this first form of writing was solely used as a memory aid to ancient orators. I'm sorry, the lack of word there, the lack of continuation has scrambled my brain. Metered verse. The most common form of oral transmission, especially in ancient Greece. Aristotle recommended a slight form of meter for his rhetoric students called the paean, 3 short beats to each long. Roman rhetorics such as Cicero and Quintilian used patterns called cursus based on word length and syllable stress to end clauses. English doesn't have a major spoken framework for rhetoric unless you're reading poems. Punctuation. The jots, titles, and points that break up a sentence, usually written, to make it more understandable. They began as breath marks in Scriptio continua, but also combined with rhetorical phrase structure. The 3 most basic marks, the period, the comma, and the colon. And they are named after the rhetorical structures of various lengths. These effects were most notably used by 16th and 17th century writers such as Jonathan Swift and Isaac Newton. Before printing became common, punctuation was often used to structure arguments as well as sentences. Nowadays, periods are often placed at those idea breaks. So while the length of a sentence has decreased, the length of an idea has not. Monotony. An effect created by a lack of prosody within a text. For instance, the cat chases the dog. The dog chases the cat. The cat chases a mouse. The mouse chases the cheese. The mouse chases the dog. The cheese chases the rat. What? Most audiences find this effect incredibly boring and actively uninteresting. So most modern writers and readers switch up their sentence structures, topics, and lengths to maintain the audience's interest. Aposiopesis. One of the rare figures that uses prosody. So aposiopesis begins with a statement and then, trails off. You have to fill the gaps to find that meaning. So this is a rare figure that uses prosody. And it begins with a statement and then, trails off. So that is a actual rare figure that uses prosody in written language. Ekphanesis is an interjection inserted into a statement to express extreme emotion. The trick is to make it look spontaneous, and it's often indicated by an exclamation point. Prosodic units is a unit of sound or flow in a work. If everything goes right, these should go hand in hand with your argument. This is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style for WR311 Dr. Camper's Style class in the spring semester of 2017. This is Chapter 13, Speaker and Audience Construction. Starting with 3 relatively well-mentioned components of rhetoric here. Ethos is a potential persuasive resource selected and shaped by the rhetor's language. Pathos is an emotional state of audience. And then persona or narrator of fiction is the speaker in a story to be separate from the flesh and blood author. So the narrator of fiction is someone who is the speaker in a story and is separate from the person writing the story. The objective voice is the absence of presence and projection of rhetor in the audience. This can be savaged as an analytical concept if it is defined operationally as text without the pronoun or other naming of the rhetor or audience. Again, it's the absence of presence and projection of rhetor and the audience. It's objective. First person is where the I speaks to you. So I am speaking to you. The authoritative I is when the speaker's position or status is clear to the audience. Methodological first person features speech act verbs. I will argue. I concede. Second person produces a direct address by deliberately acknowledging the presence of listeners or readers by calling on them in some way or even making some demand on them. For example, I can tell that you are listening to the sound of my voice as I recite these terms for the style study guide, for the final that for us is in 3 days, but for you may be at some indiscriminate other point in time. The generic you glances off the actual audience member by positing a you that is not necessarily the listener or reader, but could be. For example, you are walking along down the street. So this glances off the audience member, which would be you all in this case, and it posits a you that is not necessarily the listener or reader, but it could be. Being generic allows for connection with the audience. The inclusive we unites the speaker and listener. For example, we, as in you and I, are most likely students of rhetoric here at Loyola University, Maryland. The exclusive we describes a group that the reader belongs to, but that the listener does not. I am a member of the Spring 2017 section who also happens to have had Dr. Leary for Introduction to Rhetoric. The scene starring you is when the audience appears in second person addressing in a scene constructed by the rhetor. So when the audience appears in second person to be addressed in a scene constructed by the rhetor. The open letter is addressed to some defined individual or group, but really written for a wider audience. For example, you could write an open letter to the president about whatever issue that you want, and you're hoping that not only does the president, well, most likely the president doesn't read it, but that some other group interested in that topic will actually read the letter. Plural authors is where we is used, and they take all the functions of I. So, for example, we, the jury, in this case. Footing describes the relationship between conversational partners. Consubstantiation is the sharing of substance. The apostrophe in the aversio extends the natural resource of calling on those present to calling on persons and even things not present. For example, if I were addressing the Writing Center right now, I could call upon Dr. Zimmerelli, even though she's not here, because then if I were speaking to them for whatever reason, I could then either quote her or bring her into this situation when she's not actually here. So instead of calling on those who are just here, you can call on people and even things that do not directly involve themselves in the rhetorical situation that you're speaking into. The distributio is when certain specified roles are assigned among a number of things or persons. So these roles are being distributed. Partitioning the audience is where the audience is cast in different roles and different responsibilities. Purging the audience is when you eject some audience member as not worthy of being addressed. So the partitioning basically cuts the audience into different roles and different responsibilities, and the purging of the audience is when you eject some audience member not worthy of being addressed. Ekphonesis is a crying out with emotion which needs have nothing to do with the direct address. An atasmus is a label mark, and it marks the discourse move of jesting. A lamentatio is to arouse grief in the audience, and a consolatio is to lessen grief. So the lamentation to arouse grief in the audience, and the consolation is to try and lessen grief, to console someone. The obtestatio is a request or prayer for help. The querimonia is a request in the form of a complaint that help has been deferred. The erotema is a rhetorical question which is not meant to be answered. The rogatio is a question that the rhetor asks just to answer themselves. So the difference between an erotema and a rogatio is that the erotema is a rhetorical question that's not going to be answered by anyone. And then the rogatio is the question that the rhetor asks and then answers themselves. And the aporia is neither an assertion masquerading as a question nor a question that the rhetor will answer. So whatever this is, it's not an assertion masquerading as a question, and it's not a question that the rhetor will answer. This is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style for Dr. Camper's WR311 Style class in the spring semester of 2017. This is Chapter 14, Incorporating Other Voices. Direct speech or oratio recta, or direct quotation, is where narrators take exact words of another narrator and put them into a new context. Typically, the narrator is referenced and quotation marks are used. Think of a direct quote or citation in a paper. For example, she said, "I don't like the color orange." Indirect speech, or oratio obliqua, it is not word for word. The exact words are paraphrased. For example, the example from indirect speech is changed to, "She mentioned that she doesn't like the color orange." And then free indirect speech is a mix of direct and indirect speech. Reporting speech acts. These are deeds or actions done by speaking them. They are action or performative verbs to describe an action such as boasting, promising, denying, etc. Instead of the narrator directly or indirectly quoting, they can report the action. For example, "My wallet is empty." He lied that his wallet was empty. I, the narrator, also have an empty wallet. Representing thoughts. Inner thoughts are constructed to the presentation of thoughts in a text. They can have different versions of an idea. Direct thought. For example, Roger thought, quote, "I want a hot dog for lunch," end quote. Indirect thought. Roger thought he should have a hot dog for lunch. And finally, the report of a thought act. Roger decided to eat a hot dog for lunch. So in that last one, this decision is already done. So Roger decided to eat a hot dog for lunch, instead of Roger saying in his mind by thinking, "I want a hot dog for lunch." Text as speakers and text acts. Text can be used as speaking voices. For example, the Constitution says, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," end quote. Progymnasmata is a rhetorical curriculum, quote, "a set of rudimentary exercises that helped students of rhetoric." There's a nice link in the study guide too. Prosopopia, under invented speakers, is when the rhetor communicates to the audience by speaking as an inanimate or imagined object. This is an exercise when inventing the speech of others. Ethopopia attributes speech to a real person. This is another exercise when inventing speech of others. Aetolopia attributes speech to the dead, and this is another exercise when inventing the speech of others. And heteroglossia is the mixture of authorial speech and voice with the speech of narrators of inserted stylized versions of oral and written genres, and of different characters. Now, this is a mixture of styles that can be seen, for example, in many novels, and is similar to the technique illusion. Double-voiced and dialogic is multi-voicing with two voices instead of 3, 4, or 5. So for double voicing or the dialogic, it needs to be two voices. And this is when a text is spoken by both those who use ceremonial language and by the author or narrator, so it's two-dimensional. The speaker or rhetor is trying to anticipate and, quote, "understand what their audience feels and thinks and then cater to their speech accordingly," end quote. So this is a good example of rhetorical manipulation by the rhetor. Multi-voicing is where multiple voices, usually 3, so the narrator and 2 characters, are embedded. At each level, the rhetor, the audience, and the intended speech act change. This is often seen in blogging. This is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style for Dr. Camper's WR311 class in the spring of 2017. This is Chapter 15, Situation and Occasion. Deixis is the Greek pointing. It's a context of utterance, the immediate situation where a verbal exchange occurs. Deictic elements refer to words that identify people and relevant objects. I am going to give you this. Deixis refers to immediate physical surroundings and the time of their speaking. So it refers to the immediate physical surroundings and the situation at the time of the oration. The speaker's deictic center refers to how simple deixis can be expanded to include space, time, and modality, and can sometimes be metaphoric. So deixis can expand from just these immediate physical surroundings to include these other elements of space, time, and modality. Kairos is timing as in a singular moment. Chronos is linear time in dates, years, or eras. Ocasio is a reference to the occasion, a reason the speaker and audience are brought together. Constructing a situation and an occasion, such as an epideictic, is important for the speaker to be able to do in order to connect with the audience and convey rhetorical purpose, aka a wedding toast or a eulogy. Exigence is referred to as something that written texts need to carry, like a turtle carrying its shell. It's the rhetor's construction of a pressing external occasion that the text is addressing, meaning the occasion, issue, or the problem addressed by the text. Exigence answers the question, why are you telling me this? The Burkean scene is a time, place, and occasion as rhetorical constructions. Who, what, when, where, why, and how. Imaginary deixis is a scene recreated for persuasive purposes. A forensic speaker recreates a crime for a jury. As Aristotle says, we ought to see what is being done rather than what is going to be done. Strand 1 is energia, and that's language that conveys motion and activity. Strand 2 animates objects so they move and act. And strand 3 visualizes and renders in words what someone has seen or might see. Demonstratio is where an event is so described in words that the business seems to be enacted and the subject to pass vividly before our eyes. Descriptio is a literal term for vivid descriptions. And energia, from our friend Quintilian, which is different from energia, is a quality of language that goes beyond the requirements of clarity and appropriateness, and hence is a matter of forcefulness, the fourth quality of good style. Such mental images can induce a state of emotion in an audience, also known as fantasia. And ekphrasis is descriptive language that needs to match the nature of the subject. This is Dr. Fahnestock's rhetorical style for Dr. Camper's WR311 style class in spring semester 2017. This is chapter 16, Coherence. Coherence is a perception in the minds of the listeners and readers, so the audience, and it satisfies the four demands of clarity. Global coherence is an overall plan or purpose. The genera discendi is the rhetorical genres. Exigence is having a point to make and finding a way to make that point, and the exigence is vital to addressing the audience coherently. Given means known information. New/comment is a new piece of information. Antinomasiae is renaming of a phrase. Frames and schemas are bundled information. A schema is like an organized collection of background information. Story grammars are common plot lines. Scripts are common event structures. Discourse knowledge is a knowledge of the meaning of relationships that can exist between clauses, and this is an expectation of given or new knowledge. Non-conclusion violates the usual premise-conclusion relation. Anomalous sequence is any consecutive clause which violates a predictable sequence. Restatement is signaled by that is or in other words. Replacement negates one statement and replaces it with another statement that, in effect, corrects the first. So the replacement negates one statement that's already been made and then replaces it with another statement that effectively corrects the first. And then exception is signaling out one item in a set as different from the rest. This is Dr. Fahnestock's rhetorical style for Dr. Camper's WR311 class in the spring of 2017. This is chapter 17, passage patterns. There are 6 parts of oration: exordium, narratio, partitio, confirmatio, refutatio, peroratio. Define an ideal. Length and order can be varied. So each one of those 6 things, exordium, narratio, partitio, confirmatio, refutatio, and peroratio, all define an ideal. The exordium is the introduction, and it integrates the audience. So it integrates the audience with what they're about to hear. The narratio is to give the facts of the case with the appropriate spin. The partitio is to define the issue at stake and the coming points. The confirmatio is to deliver the arguments in favor of the rhetor's case. The refutatio is to dispose of the opponent's arguments by mentioning them and then addressing them. And the peroratio is to summarize the argument and strengthen its emotional impact and the audience's involvement. So each one of these functions as a component to an argument that needs to exist as a well-functioning machine. And there is somewhat of a chronology between them, from exordium to peroratio. A syllogism is a three-part structure for inferential reasoning and requires statements with linking verbs, three carefully positioned recurring terms, and distinct quantifiers. And it makes claims of inclusion, exclusion, and partial overlap. So this is a three-part structure for inferential reasoning. And it requires statements with linking verbs, three carefully positioned recurring terms, and distinct quantifiers. And there are four forms of syllogism. There's the universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, and particular negative. And combined, these four statement types yield 24 possible syllogisms, which are then grouped into sets according to grammatical position. Units of argument is when closer to canonical syllogistic form carries the appearance of airtight reasoning, and this is a divisive emphasis. The enthymeme is a type of syllogism and is deduced from a few premises, often from fewer than regular syllogism. For, if any one of these is well known, there is no need to mention it. A minimum, quote, claim plus premise, unquote, unit. The enabling major premise is usually missing. The progymnasmata is an exercise formed by late antiquity, and it's a series that requires all students to find the ability to narrate and furthers the requirement by making them tell the same story backwards or starting from the middle. Now, the Crea is an exercise which requires all students to take a saying or deed and then explain its significance. To paraphrase is using words with a correct connotative slant. Comparison is defined in the inventional side of rhetoric as a line of argument introducing a similarity or dissimilarity, usually for the purpose of characterizing or defining, sometimes for the purpose of evaluating. In the progymnasmatic exercise tradition, a comparison is a module that can be inserted at any point in a discourse for purposes of support and clarification. The paragraph is a written and essentially visual unit of discourse, and speakers use paragraphs to segment speech into units larger than one sentence. Paragraphos is the mark on the side of a manuscript to indicate a topic change. And there are four genres of paragraphs: description, narration, exposition, and argument. The sequence structure is any narration ordered chronologically or any description ordered spatially, provided that it is adequately signposted and it will be readily perceived. The question and answer. A paragraph with this structure opens by posing a question and then answering it, known as the figure of hypophora. Hypophora, right. Generalization plus support. Opens with a general claim and subsequent sentences that provide supporting examples of detail. Antithetical structure. The speaker develops one point but then contradicts or qualifies it, either devoting the remaining paragraph to the contradiction/alternative/contrast or returning in the conclusion to the opening position. Paratactic prose. Clauses are loosely connected, creating a looping discourse. Hypotactic prose. Sentences are connected by the interclausal relations. Preparatio is where the rhetor not only announces the coming sections, but also explains ahead of time their purpose and sometimes even their intended effect. Expeditio is the device of setting out numbered options and then eliminating all but the one preferred. And then transitio shepherds the listener or reader from one section to another. So expeditio is called expeditio because it sets out numbered options and then eliminates all but the one preferred. Transitio sounds very similar to transition because it shepherds the listener or reader from one section to another. The preparatio is the rhetor not only announcing the coming sections, so signaling to what's about to happen, but then also explains ahead of time their purpose and sometimes even their intended effect. It's very, it's an explanation being delivered. This is Dr. Fahnestock's Rhetorical Style for Dr. Camper's WR311 class in the spring of 2017. This is Chapter 18, Amplification. Amplification is making an element stylistically important. Meiosis, or diminutio, is making an element unimportant stylistically, so the opposite of amplification. There are 5 strategies of amplification. 1. Heightening through strategic word choices. 2. A series of construction. 3. A comparison for the sake of inflating or deflating. 4. Heightening through reasoning. 5. Congeries. Congeries are an accumulation of words and sentences identical in meaning, and it may also be regarded under the head of amplification. Copia means abundance. Congeries is grouped under this term, a complex construct in humanist language theory. Epikyreme is the idea that a claim or premise structure should be expanded to give it heft and salience to the audience. 2 versions of this argument form, each in 5 parts, come down from the antiquity. Brevity is getting a point across with rapidity and without waste of detail, expressing a great deal in very few words. As has been mentioned, though, brevity should not always be associated with clarity. Diminishing involves cutting back the attention paid to an included element. Equipolentia is a phrasing that negates the opposite, also tends to diminish a point, as do anticipatory subjects and normalizations. Subline can lift the souls with a proud exaltation and a sense of vaunting joy and leave the audiences with the impression that they themselves have produced what they have heard. That's sublime.